What is up, guys, and welcome back to Music Talks. My name is Brennan, and this is the second official episode. We're diving into the second part of the best albums of 2024. There's still so many to talk about. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of releases throughout the rest of the year. We stopped in a little bit of April, May, around that time, but there's still so many releases in April and May to go through all the way to November. And we might have a third part. We'll see how this goes. There's going to be some other stuff to talk about at the end. We're going to get into some honorable mentions, some other notable releases, some good EPs that came out, just the full thing. So I'm super excited, and we're going to get right into it. All right, so like I mentioned in the previous episode, this year has been full of sleeper albums and sleeper hits and things that have just grown. And we've seen that trend a lot recently over the years with artists and songs and albums that have been released in previous years, or even just the beginning of the year that didn't blow up until later. And, you know, the biggest example of that would be like Chappell Roan, who literally released an album last year and then reached number 2 on the charts this year, which is insane when literally no one knew who she was last year, and now she's close to a household name. So I think that's super cool. We've seen hits like Cruel Summer by Taylor Swift and Die For You by The Weeknd. We're seeing some hits that got skipped over, just didn't get much attention over the past couple of years, get attention now, which is kind of just a weird trend that's happening, but I think it's super cool. But with that, this year we have seen a lot of albums and artists follow that trend, is where they've grown in popularity over time. And, you know, I think the most recent example that I can think of, besides Chappell, would be Dua Lipa, who released her album early 2020 with Future Nostalgia. And it was kind of like people knew like 1 or 2 songs off that album, but an entire year later, it reached a new peak after the Grammys and things like that. So I think that with that, we're going to see a lot of that. And so I've even picked up on some over the past couple months, even over the past couple of weeks, of some ones that I missed out on or had just been slowly rising in the ranks. So I'm going to take it back before we get into the rest of April and talk about an album that was released in February, and that is 2 Star and the Dream Police by Mk.gee. So this is an artist that I had never heard of until literally like a month and a half, 2 months ago. I had seen some artists posting about him. I had seen a couple of people that I know had gone to a show of his in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was like, this guy is interesting. He's different, right? And I kind of like skimmed through his album a couple months ago and didn't really get fully into it. And then in the past couple of weeks, I've been really getting into him. And since I filmed the first part, I had realized how much of a mistake it was to leave him off of the original list of February releases that are just the best albums of the year. So we're going to talk a little bit about him. I love artists who have such a unique sound that you cannot compare them to literally anyone else, past or present. And I think that's so cool. He's definitely one of these artists. I've got a couple people on this list that are like that, and I think that just shows that maybe they aren't the biggest artist, but they have longevity and they're going to make it, and you know they're going to have an impact on the industry and just music as a whole, and trends, and you know they're going to be around for a while. And I think that that's the cool thing about artists that have such originality, is that there is no one like them, and he's definitely one of these artists. Just very special. And like I said, it's not an artist that I think many people know. I think a lot of people in the music industry have picked up on him and have picked up on his talent. And, you know, kind of doing some research on him, I've seen a lot of artists that are a big fan of his. And sometimes a lot of musicians or artists pick up on these kind of like hidden gems in the music industry a lot sooner than the general public does, and sometimes ever, which is really unfortunate. But we have another couple of examples I think of is like Ray and Victoria Monet, who have been working their butts off for years and just hit public prominence in the last year or two, which is insane to think. And I just think it's really cool when, artists are able to point out other really cool artists, and this is definitely one of those. His album it falls under the alternative spectrum, which, I think alternative music is almost as broad and wide of a spectrum as pop music is now. You get more pop leaning music, you get rock leaning music, you get folk music, all kinds of stuff. And I literally don't know how to explain it. It's such an interesting album and concept, and I'm interested to get into more of his work, but it's just a very lo-fi feeling, and I feel like lo-fi music and just kind of that chill vibe, definitely not common to see on a mainstream scale at all, but I think it's just the perfect vibe for when you need a relaxing sound. But the cool thing about this is that while it does lean into that lo-fi spectrum, it's also got some really great guitar work on it, some guitar riffs, and I think that he's done this primarily by himself and recorded, and it's just a phenomenal album. And I think it's one of those that, like, it's not too long to where you get lost in it and you feel kind of like worn out by the end of it. It was an album that I've actually, over the last couple of days, like, found myself listening to it on loop, like, over and over, and that doesn't happen very often for me, but I think a lot of people too, is that albums sometimes don't keep the attention of the listeners in the same way that it used to. So with this, I think that it was a super cool project, and I found myself wanting to, like, continuously listen to it and dive deeper into the world of, like, his music, and I think that's really special. I think that's really cool. And I'm excited to see more from this guy. I think the coolest thing that stuck out to me was the entire time that I was listening to this album, I felt like it was recorded in, like, a big empty room, and it just has like the ethereal sound of live music and live instrumentation, and it's not very common. You see a lot of times artists put out live albums and the music does not sound like it does in a studio, and I think that he has somehow managed to capture this very interesting mix of studio and live recording, and from the videos and the things I've seen, he sounds exactly the same in person. But yeah, I'm super excited to see his career blow up, and I think that, like I said, I think he's going to be a sleeper album here. I think that while it was released in February, he's slowly getting more and more popularity, more traction, and I think over the next year or two, it's definitely going to blow up for him for sure. So next, we're going to skip back to April, where we left off. We've got a couple more releases. I think we got 3 more. The first one is Maggie Rogers' third album, Don't Forget Me. I think that Maggie Rogers is a phenomenal artist and a phenomenal songwriter. There is not much in terms of female artists that are like her. She has really tapped into her songwriting, into a folk sound with this album, and I think that she's had a lot of artistic growth, a lot of versatility in her music. Her first album, I feel like, was very indie pop. Her second was like a little bit more alt rock. There was a lot of like big sounds on it, and this one is just extremely stripped back. It is a lot of times just her guitar and her vocals, and I think that that's a super interesting direction for her to go. It's only 10 songs, which I feel like is definitely the sad part about this album, is that it does feel a little bit short compared to her previous work. And I will say that it's not my favorite album from Maggie, but you can't discredit it at all. It is a phenomenal album. Don't Forget Me, the title track, is one of the best songs that was released this year. So good. I think that this is probably a direction she's going to continue to go in, as it's shown that it's very well received. It has a little bit of a Nashville sound. I think that she has definitely spent some time with some Nashville songwriters, people that are familiar with that area, and it's very clear to see. And I think that she's going to continue to gain popularity, and I want that for her too. I think it is definitely a solid album from her. I think that it's probably just a little bit lost in that country folk alt trend that has been happening this year. I think it got a little bit lost in that, but there are some really great tracks on here, and she has some of the best vocals in the industry for sure, and I'm really excited to see what she does next. If you've liked her previous work, definitely give it a try. It's got her phenomenal songwriting in it. It's just a little bit different musically, but still really, really solid. So next, this was one that I didn't expect at all, but this is the original score and soundtrack from the Challengers film starring Zendaya. And if you're not familiar with that movie, it is kind of like a drama comedy where it's almost a love triangle between her and Mike Fast and Josh O'Connor, and they play tennis, and essentially it's this back and forth almost competition between fighting for her while she just wants to watch tennis between them and wants to see good competition, right? And so I think that the soundtrack to this really elevated the movie and really like added tension to a lot of scenes that may have been feeling a little bit flat otherwise. And yeah, it was just a super, super cool soundtrack. They also released a version of it that was mixed, like a DJ mix, to where it was like a continual flow, and that was a really cool thing to listen to as well. Now, I think that the cool thing about this album is that it has like a repeating sound, a repeating theme that is seen across several different tracks on the album, to where like you can hear this sound and relate it to the movie, to the scenes, and you know that like a certain part of the song that is repeated across different tracks is used to like signal a certain important moments in the movie. So I think that was really cool. And of course, the best thing about this is that it was made by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, which are, in my opinion, one of the best producer duos in the industry right now, and they can literally do anything. And if you're not familiar with them, they are in 9 Inch Nails, which is a very interesting thing to go from like heavy metal rock to scoring movies and video games and producing for people. But they are phenomenal, and pretty much anything that they do nowadays is completely different than any other project they've released. So I think that that's the cool thing, is when you see their names attached to a product, that you know it's going to sound completely different than anything else they've ever done before. And this was super interesting for me because it almost had like a dance EDM. I mean, it does. It has a heavy, heavy influence from EDM music and dance music. And yeah, it's phenomenal. And I think it does a great job of telling the story through the music, but it's also just enjoyable. If you like listening to electronic music, it's great. Trent and Atticus are phenomenal. I can't wait to see what they do next. I'm always intrigued to see what else they do. I think they did a couple other movie soundtracks this year, which were completely different from this one. And I know they're doing a couple of video game soundtracks in the next couple of years. And yeah, they are great. There's not any words or like original singing from like Zendaya or anybody in the songs, but they're definitely enjoyable. If you enjoy that kind of music, it's definitely one of the best soundtracks of the year. And moving on to our last album in the month of April, this is one that took me by surprise. I did not expect this to be as phenomenal as it was. And that was the album Boundaries from R&B artist Sinead Harnett. Now, Sinead is kind of a secret in the R&B world, and you don't hear a lot about her. I think that she has a very loyal fan base. She has a very strong sense and sound and followers, but on a big scale, not very well known. She got a couple albums that were just very classic R&B albums that were just full of confidence and love songs and just very unapologetic. And I think that is kind of what garnered a lot of attention for her in the past. But this album was very mature, very different than her previous work. I think her last album, which I believe was Ready Is Always Too Late, was an album that I guess she saw a lot of talking about regret or, discussing decisions that she's made in relationships. And there was some love songs and things like that in there. But this album is almost like this therapeutic album for her, as well as like listeners. It's very relatable. I think the thing that originally hooked me on her music this year was the single Thinking Less, which I would venture to say is one of the top 5, possibly the number 1 R&B hit of the year, and that's Thinking Less. And it's just this unapologetic kind of like moody, chill song about being confident in you and in your place and not letting anyone basically take you for granted and being confident in knowing your worth. And with that, like I said, it's very low key, but it's kind of got this like really heavy bass and 808 in the background that is just kind of like, it's very groovy, it's very vibey. And so if you're into R&B music, this is the song that I think represents the album as a whole the most, as far as the sound and what you expect to get out of it. And yeah, it's great. And I found myself on so many occasions with this album being insanely taken back by how great her vocal runs are and how great she is able to like just belt notes, but like in a way that's like soft and quiet and not like overbearing at all. And that's something that's not very common a lot. I think we see a lot of that, and like Billie Eilish's kind of music kind of reminds me of that. And I think that she's also got some sound very similar to like Snow Allegra, and there are some songs and some sounds that reminded me of hers music. And yeah, I think this is just a really great third album for her. It's a healing album. It's very different. It's very confident in what it is. It's very confident in the power of healing and therapy and putting yourself first, and boundaries. I think the name speaks for itself, putting up boundaries for what you need. And it doesn't focus too much on like big punchy things and big punchy topics. It's focusing more on just the healing aspect, and I think that was different for her, but also very different for R&B music as a whole. That's more of like a pop music thing, I feel like, but it is definitely a good direction for her. I am excited to see what she does next as well. All right, so now we're going to move into May. We are still not even halfway through the year, and there's so many good releases, and May is one of the months of this year, and usually pretty much every year, where we see so many big releases. And some of my favorite albums of all time this year came out in the month of May, and I think it was just a very, very busy month, but definitely some of the best of the year came out in May. And I kind of wish some of these albums had been more evenly distributed between the months of this year, like I've said about a couple other albums, but it's good. I'm okay with how the direction it took. But yeah, I think I've got, 6 albums for the month of May, which is very heavy. But let's get into it. So we're going to talk about a very mixed reviewed album of the year, and one that I think is phenomenal. One, because I enjoy this artist as a whole lot, and all of her work, but also because it's just a great album, and it's very underrated, and it just got kind of mixed in with all the other major pop girl releases. But that is Radical Optimism by Dua Lipa. And like I said, mixed reviews. I think it kind of got destroyed by the social media and stan culture. They just kind of came together and decided that it wasn't a great album. And I think that, unfortunately, because Dua Lipa has so much longevity in her eras or her album cycles, that kind of was a harm to her. You know, she just came off of last year having the hit Dance the Night from the Barbie soundtrack, which was a huge song that was nominated for Grammys and Golden Globes and Emmys and almost got an Oscar nomination. And I think that, you know, Future Nostalgia was one of the top albums of 2020. It was her breakthrough. And that album cycle went for years and years, you know, and then after, you know, we saw Don't Start Now being the top song in from a female in 2020, and then we saw Levitating being the number one song of the whole year. And then, you know, we saw her get into the Cold Heart remix with Elton John. She's just a really hardworking individual that is constantly releasing and working and touring. And I'm not really sure exactly what went wrong with this album for her. But I'm not going to dwell on all the negatives. I will just say that this album, I think, took a very different direction than it originally planned. I think that maybe there's some stuff behind the scenes that didn't work out the way that it originally was marketed or planned. But she did get her highest charting debut song at the end of last year with Houdini. And I think that had this album maybe have come out last year, it would have performed a little bit better commercially. But I think that she has shown this year that no matter if she's got a new album out or she's still playing the same songs, people show up for her and people will go see her in concert. I mean, it's insane to think about how she honestly is on a stadium level for touring this year, but it's not. I think she's playing like 5 nights at Madison Square Garden, 5 nights at the Kia Forum in a row. That's insane. Like, that's not a common thing. And of course, concert culture and live music is a very big thing now, and people are just like dying to get into that. But that's not very common, especially for somebody who's just on their 3rd album and is also not a U.S. act, is a UK act. You know, touring in the U.S. is not something that you see a lot of demand for unless you're a huge artist from overseas, like Adele, who even Adele, it took a couple of years for her to get that big boom. But I think that this album still produced so many really good songs. Of course, Houdini, just great dance pop record. Illusion is another one of my favorites. The song on here that I think that is really the most potential to be a huge hit, and I don't understand why it hasn't been, is These Walls, which is more of like a light, kind of summery, sad pop ballad, kind of just like pop basic song, but not basic. And it's very different than her normal dance track. I think that Houdini and Illusion and a couple other ones on this album were very heavy dance leaning, and this song was very different. It was very lean back. It was very open and honest, and I think it kind of gave you a look into her romantic side, her love life, and I think that she's always been very open and very honest about not putting too much of her personal life in her music and wanting things to still be relatable, things wanting to be fun and enjoyable. And I think that's sometimes why people are turned off by her music, is because they don't feel like they really know her personally. But I in no way see that as a bad thing. I think that she's entitled to put her music out with as little or as much story or of her personal life in it as she wants. Not everything has to have 2 to 3 years of lore in the music to be enjoyable. Some things can be simple and fun, and I think that this being released around the time that Taylor's album came out. Taylor Swift is a very big on lore and storytelling and things like that. And so I think when you put that up against Taylor's work and her songwriting, it kind of just got overshadowed, and people were not understanding that this is just a simple, fun record, and it doesn't have to be deep. The lyrics don't have to have all of these mixed messages and all of these secret hidden things that the public are supposed to pick up on. And I think that this is a perfect example of that, and it was not taken for that. It was taken to be this, oh, we want to know more about Dua, we want to know more about her personal life and this and that. And I don't think that's what she intended at all. I think she's very proud of this work. She's very proud of the sound that she made. And I honestly would have liked to see this album come out maybe a month or two later. I think that it is a perfect summer, sitting by the pool or on the beach listening to this album. I think is perfect. I think that it's just very relatable and doesn't get too deep. And like I said, the title is Radical Optimism, and I think that's kind of the overall vibe that she wanted with this album, is just looking for the good in all situations. And it's very clear to see from the beginning of the album to the end. Now, it is only 11 tracks, and I think that we'll probably get a deluxe from her in the next year. But I think that's my only downside with Dua's music, is that she produces sometimes shorter albums, a little bit more on the shorter side, but there's no filler songs. She's very much telling a story from track 1 to track 11, the start of a romance and falling in love, through the grief, through the heartbreak, through the moving on, and then ending with, just a lot of messages of just being happy for people that maybe aren't in your life anymore, and just that maturity and that growth. And, she's got a song on the album called Happy For You, where she talks about, in the lyrics she says, I must have loved you more than I've ever known, because I'm happy for you. I'm not mad, I'm not hurt. I hope you get everything you deserve. And I think that is just like a really cool message to send, that, not everything has to be anger and heartbreak and this person versus this person and, oh, I hate my ex and things like that. And she's just kind of portraying this story of going through the motions of relationships and love and finding yourself. And at the same time, it's got messages that are relatable, but it's still a very simple and fun album that you don't have to dive deep into to get the message and to make it enjoyable. With this album, it was still, I would say, similar to Future Nostalgia's sound, but not as nostalgic, for lack of a better word. It was just leading into that kind of summery dance pop vibe, and not necessarily more of a retro sound that Future Nostalgia had. And I just really hated that this album did not get as much credit as it deserved. I think that she is going to continue to have a very long-lasting career, and to see everything that she's conquered in just her very short couple of years is insane. And still, even with not a whole lot of attention in the US, she still had 3 of the top 10 dance songs of the year, and she also still hit number 2 on the Billboard 200 in its first week, which was a new peak for her. And that was just right behind Taylor Swift. So she's still killing it. I think that unfortunately sometimes she falls victim to stan culture and that aspect, but I think that she's still very well loved and respected, both on an industry standpoint, but also on a general public standpoint. And that's all that matters. I'm hoping that we get a deluxe version from that album, just kind of like she did with the Future Nostalgia Moonlight Edition. But if we don't, I think that she's still probably got a lot of things up her sleeve, and I think that it's going to be completely fine for her. But like I said, it's still a solid work. Definitely one of my favorite albums of the year. Next one, we're also talking about another really, really, really big album, and a contender, in my opinion, for Album of the Year, the Grammys, but also number 1 album of the year in general. And this is not something that prior to this album release I would have thought or even considered, honestly. And that's Hit Me Hard and Soft by Billie Eilish. This girl is, I mean, still in her early 20s. She's got now 3 albums under her belt, and what she's accomplished is insane. I think that she will end up being one of the youngest people to get an EGOT, the Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. She's already got 3 of the 4. And, I think that she has conquered so much in her career, and that has inspired her to work harder and to create the best work that she possibly can. This album took me completely by surprise. I knew it would be a good album, but nothing to this level at all. I think I wouldn't really consider myself a Billie Eilish fan. I respect her work. I didn't really care for her very first album, but Happier Than Ever is where I really started to pay more attention to her, because I think that was a very well done album. I think now looking back, she says that Happier Than Ever was maybe giving into a couple cash grab or just kind of like main basic pop sounds, and it was still just a really good album. And I think Happier Than Ever, the title track on that album, phenomenal album, and she's used kind of that formula of having a song start with one pattern and one instrumentation, one sound, and by the end of it, we're on a completely different spectrum to where you don't even realize it's the same song. And she used that formula throughout this album. One of the songs on this album, L'amour de ma vie, starts just very soft, very just her and her vocals, very stripped back. And by the end of it, we're in like this full club banger that has like just the synth, and it's amazing. And this album, like Dua's, is also very short. It's only 10 songs, but it is... I honestly, the first time I listened to it, I was speechless, and I went back and listened to it again, and I think that while it is 10 songs, which is short, it definitely leaves you wanting more, but not necessarily more tracks, just more of what you've already listened to. It's very, I don't know, I think that her and Phineas, her brother, are 2 of the most gifted songwriters, producers, and listening to this project, you would think that this would have taken hundreds of producers and musicians to make this album, and it is just phenomenal what her and her brother are able to do. This album is just very melodramatic, very chill. It's also got some lo-fi vibes in it, but it's also got some really strong, positive pop beats. We've got Birds of a Feather, which was kind of the general public's chosen single. I think that she was originally pushing Lunch as a single, which both are very strong pop hits. But Birds of a Feather ended up being one of the biggest songs of the year, and it is a great album. And I think that this is just a very, very mature body of work for her, and I think that she will continue to make work that is just unique to her and very different. I don't think that she's ever not going to surprise us, and I think that she is definitely one of these artists that will be around for a very long time because no one is doing things like she is. And this album is just it's definitely her most mature work, but it's definitely one of the best albums of this year and one of the best albums in recent years, and I was just completely blown away. This album sold like a killer 300,000 units in its first week and still hit number 2. This is where we started to fall under the Taylor Swift charting thing, but I think that also just goes to show that in the long run, chart performance means absolutely nothing in the long run in terms of music and talent and what is good and what's not. And this album is phenomenal, and I think that it's definitely one of I would say the top 3 contenders to win Album of the Year at the Grammys, and I a lot of times don't like to see albums from artists that have won recently or like past couple of years, but I think this is a very well-deserved album. If it does win, it is phenomenal, and yeah, I think it was a really cool decision for her to not release any singles from this album prior. She wanted it to be listened to from front to back, and I think that's a really cool artistic decision, and I think a lot of the artistic decisions on this album were spot on. Wonderful, beautiful work. And yeah, I think that there's been rumors that maybe she'll release a second part to a companion album for this. If she doesn't, I think that it's still phenomenal work. And I think that this is a phenomenal album. Her definite best work. And I would like to see how she's going to top this next, because I know that she will in some way come up with some phenomenal new concept. But she is, yeah, killer for sure. Next, we're going to move into a very interesting album, to say the least. That is Room Under the Stairs by Zayn. Now, of course, we know Zayn is one of the 5 original members of One Direction and has now released 4 albums, and it almost feels like he's starting again. He's starting a new solo career, honestly. He has had a very interesting relationship with charting and public appearances and things like that. And, his very first album, well, basically his first 2 albums were extremely R&B leaning, very similar to The Weeknd's work, and great work. And his third album was a little bit more pop leaning, but still leading into some R&B influences. And I think that's a very, very good sound for him to tap into. It works with his voice and the kind of music that I think he wants to make. It is great. This is a completely different direction. This album is one of those that fell into that alt kind of folk sound. It is, dare I say, a country-leaning album, which honestly, I don't know how to even... When you think about Zayn, the last thing that you ever think that you need is a country album from him. And I think that he's the kind of artist that can make any kind of music that he puts his mind to, but he's got a voice that is definitely more so suited to soulful type of music. And so getting the first or 2 singles from this album, I was like, what direction is this album going to go in? And it is very different. And I think that even though it is leaning into that kind of alt country sound, it is not too much in that direction, if that makes sense. This album is like 17 tracks, and it's definitely his most personal work. And he has done a phenomenal campaign with this album. Over his career, he has expressed his mental health concerns, his anxiety, and wanting to take care of himself. And I totally agree with him. I think that him putting himself first and what he needs, but still also being able to put out music is just something that's to be very well respected, because sometimes we see people give too much of themselves to the point where they snap, and that's not something that we ever want to see happen. But because of that, of course, his commercial success kind of took a hit with that. But I don't think that was a huge concern for him. But of course, we have only ever gotten one public like award show or any kind of performance from him in his career. We've never gotten a tour from him. Nothing. And so this direction, he has a daughter now, and he has just found this newfound confidence in himself. And, very often he said that he wants to do this for his daughter, and he wants his daughter to be proud of him. And I think that's just so respectful to her, but also to himself. And with that, we've gotten meet and greets and album signings, and he's on his very first tour right now, and just so much has happened. And I'm just, honestly, while this may not be his best album, it's still a great album, and I think that all of the baggage and everything that he's been through this with his career and just One Direction, and of course the loss of Liam Payne this year, this is just a testament to him putting his best self forward and wanting a very substantial career and just wanting his daughter to be proud of him. And I think that is wonderful. And now, his very first album debuted at number 1 on the charts, which was insane. We thought that it was going to be him and Harry both being the two front runners of success from this band. His second album debuted at like 61 on the charts. His third album was in the 40s, and which is not bad at all. Obviously, like I said, charts are not everything, but I think it shows that he has a huge following, but it didn't necessarily carry over to listeners and people buying his album just because they weren't able to see him in his life. And he was honestly just being a hermit and sheltering himself from the world. And I think that that's completely fine. But I think his music has definitely taken a hit because of that, and people have missed out on some really great work from him. But he debuted at number 15, which is just moving back up, and I think that he will continue to grow and build more of a fan base for himself over the years, because he's just found himself in his music again. He's ready to put himself out there, and I think it's super, super cool to see him touring for the first time ever. And I think that the story and everything that he's been through and what this work means to him just adds to the music. And he also released B-sides, a couple of deluxe tracks as well, and I think that it's a solid project. It really is. It's still just a very weird thing to take in, to see him have this kind of like Western alt sound with his R&B, but I think that it definitely keeps your attention enough to be like, where's this going to go next? And I definitely think that it was an underrated album from this year, and I'm just happy to see him back in the public eye and more happy with his releases and everything. So definitely give his album a chance. Even if you didn't like his previous work, this album is completely different than the other ones. Definitely give it a try. Next, we're going to move into what I believe is the 5th release from this band, and this is Neon Pill from Cage the Elephant. Now, Cage the Elephant is from my hometown here in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and they've always kind of been around, and I've known of them. And of course, they got some Grammy recognition with their last album, Social Cues, but they are the standard, the spotlight for alt rock bands, and I think that this was their most mainstream leaning album, but I think that they probably picked up some new fans that are definitely not more in tune with that rockier, edgier sound that's been in their past couple of releases. This was the first full project from them that I enjoyed. Of course, they've got really good hits, of obviously Cigarette Daydreams being one of their biggest hits, and I think that this album is a completely different direction from that. Now, their last album came out in 2019, and that was several years ago, so they've been out of the public eye for quite some time. I think behind the scenes, their frontrunner, Matt, he, dealt with a lot of mental health struggles, and he put a lot of that story and what he's overcome into this album, and I think that is definitely just great. I love when artists are very upfront about their mental health and putting that into their music, because that's very relatable, and it's not anything to be ashamed of, and so it's very, very commendable to see that on display, especially from an alt rock band, which would probably not normally lean in that direction. But this album is it's almost like psychedelic folk. Like I said, it's a little bit more mainstream leaning, but it is a great album from them. I think that you could pick up this album not knowing any of their previous work and respect what they've done with it for sure. I would say that maybe it's probably not their favorite album within their fan base. I know I have a friend who his favorite album, his favorite artist is Cage's Elephant, and he said this album was very different for him, and I think that is just part of music as a whole, as that artists take new directions, try new things out, and I think that their fan base was probably not expecting this, especially after winning an album for so many years. But I do think it was a great album that will definitely expand their fan base for sure. Now next, we're going to move into one of the best hip-hop artists and hip-hop albums, in my opinion, and that is from Vince Staples, who is criminally underrated. His album Dark Times, this was his 6th album, and this was his last album with his label Def Jam. And something about Vince's work is just so unique and so different, and I think so often in hip-hop music and rap, it's not very cool or common to just kind of tell stories and just focus on the narrative and being real and open and honest. And Vince just continues to show time and time again that you don't have to follow the trends and the lanes that maybe a certain genre has set up. And he has done that once again with this album. His last album, Ramona Park Broke My Heart, was a phenomenal album that kind of paid homage to his hometown and where he's from. And this album, Dark Times, it almost feels like a connected story. It's just straight art. And I think so often, my problem with hip-hop music and rap, obviously, I'm not the general target audience for hip-hop music and rap in general, but I continuously find myself just like diving deeper and deeper into Vince's work because he just has such an artistic vision and an artistic sound, and he just puts a lot of thoughtfulness and creativity into all of his songs. And while doing this, he chooses to, instead of, talking about money and drugs and whatever, he instead talks about, racism and police brutality. He talks about relationships and, being cheated on or not being faithful to. He talks about his hometown. He talks about the things that he's going through. And I think that's what makes Vince. I think that's why he has a fan base that, respects him and loves his music as much as they do, because he's just always doing something different than his peers in his genre. And I'm excited to see what he does next. He's free of his label. He's can take any direction he wants to. I saw a couple publications put this on their list, but the way that Vince continues to be criminally underrated is just insane to me. I don't understand how he is not one of the biggest rappers in the game, honestly. And I think that part of the great part about Vince is that he's so down to earth and he's so in touch with, you either like my music or you don't. And he's very authentic. He's very real, very unfiltered. And I think that he's just very different as far as his moves in the industry, but also his moves as a businessman and just his creative decisions and his production. I love his work and what he represents as an artist, and I honestly wish that more people would pay him attention. But with that, part of the shine and the specialness of Vince is that he is a little bit of an underground artist, and he's kind of a hidden gem, so to speak. And of course, he's collaborated with like Tyler the Creator and some other really big artists. but he's just continuously doing his thing, and I hope that he continues to just stay on his path and pave his own lane, because it will continuously always work for him as long as he continues to do the great work that he does. Now we're moving into our last album for May, and this is one that I picked up on last minute, but I'm so glad that I did, because it is one of the greatest albums that I've ever heard, and I don't say that lightly. That is Here in the Pitch by Jessica Pratt. So the first time I heard of Jessica Pratt was actually this year on an A$AP Rocky song that was released, and she had this kind of like angelic, soulful voice, and I was like, I've never heard of this person, right? And I didn't think anything about it. And then a couple months later, I saw that she released an album, and it was starting to pop up on a lot of publications as well. And I was like, okay, yeah, this is definitely an album that I agree is not getting the spotlight that it deserves. Jessica is a folk singer. Her music is alternative, folk labeled. But when you think of that, you're not going to at all think of the type of music that this is at all. This has a 60s sound. It is completely unlike anything that is out this year or anything remotely similar. I think that Steven Sanchez, if you're familiar with his work, makes very similar music to this, but still very, very different. Jessica's got a couple albums under her belt, but she makes music like she grew up in the 60s, in that decade, and she fully has a tap on a sound that is not common or used at all in current music. And like I said with Mk.gee, I think this is going to be a sleeper album that people are going to pick up on as people continuously post about the critical acclaim that it's getting. This is also a short album. I think it's like 9 songs, maybe 10. It's short. It's to the point. But it definitely leaves you wanting more. I think that every time I listen to this, it was one of those that I wanted to start over and listen to it more and just dive deeper and deeper into it. It's very chill. It's very different. I think that it honestly feels like this out-of-body album that takes you kind of away from mainstream music and just takes you on this journey that is just very classic feeling, very vintage. It sounds very similar to like Roberta Flack, if you're familiar with her music. This is an album that I think taps into a lot of listeners who are willing to try something brand new. And this is an album that to this day I'm still listening to a lot, and it is just so unique. And like I've said many times in this episode, that unique and artists that are doing something different is something that I always look for and always am drawn to. And I just continuously see myself going back to this album and listening and trying to just hear different things and just hearing the vocal structure and the sense and the coding that she has on her voice. There's just so many things to talk about, and it's just one of those albums that it's very hard to explain, but it's one of those that you just put your headphones in and listen to it and experience it. And it's definitely an album that I would like to see get more credit over the next year. But it is great, and I think that it definitely has that end of year fall vibes for sure. Maybe a little bit of winter vibes in there too. Check it out. I definitely recommend it. So now we're moving into June, and believe it or not, June has double the amount of albums that are on this list than May did. And obviously summer is always a jam-packed time for albums to come out. Obviously, this is going to be summertime. People want new music and they're ready to digest new things. And so we're going to kind of rush through a lot of these because there's a lot, but they're really great albums. The first one would be Born in the Wild from Tems. So this was Tems' debut album that people have been waiting on for like 6 years. And I would say that Tems is like the front runner, the person that is kind of the pioneer of bringing Afro beats into the U.S. and into that mainstream. And it's just kind of a shame that we haven't had an album from her until now. However, this one is definitely worth the wait. I always appreciated her voice and how unique it sounded. However, I didn't ever really get into her music. But this album is great. She's got J. Cole and Asake features on it. I think there's a lot of reflection on her career in this album. And like I said, it's 6 years since her debut. But it's a great album. I'm hoping to see a lot more work from her a lot sooner, rather than waiting another 6 years. But I think that it definitely sways back and forth between traditional R&B, but also traditional Afro beats, and I love that. I love that for her. She's, like I said, the pioneer for Afro beats. Her and Tyla have been killing it, and I really hope to see her continue to grow and to just make great work. The second one that I'm going to talk about for June is Radio Soul from Alfie Templeman. So Alfie Templeman is in the UK. He's not big at all in the US, but he has this like 2000s kind of young indie sound. A lot of his work honestly reminds me of the Beatles, which, not that it necessarily sounds like the Beatles, but I feel like if you were able to listen to his music but then listen to the Beatles, you would hear maybe some influences or kind of the spirit of the Beatles in that sense. This is just a kind of a psychedelic rock. A lot of his music is very indie, hippie leaning, very psychedelic, but also very heavy on like guitars and that just kind of very soft rock sound. Like I said, he's very young. He's like 21, but he makes music like he's 35, and he's lived a lot of life in his music. And I feel like the best way to describe this album and Alfie's music as a whole is like it's just straight out of an indie movie, or like just like a rom-com, something like that you would see, coming of age movie. Definitely this is the kind of music that you would hear in it. He's got a song on this album with Nile Rodgers, which is a really cool collab. Nile Rodgers is a phenomenal musician, and that song is called Just a Dance, which I think is one of the best songs of this year for sure. And that one's a little bit more kind of like dance leaning, but it is so great. And I think that if you're into kind of that indie rock sound, definitely give Alfie a chance. He's got some other albums and EPs as well. Next, we're going to talk about another one that I have literally seen no one talk about at all, and that is Moth by R&B singer Fauna Hughes. Now, excuse me, I said R&B, but she's also neo soul, which is how her music is labeled. And I think that she has a very different take on R&B music and a very different take on sound and just making an experience through your music, right? I think she, like I said, also has a little bit of a Snow Allegra vibe, if you're familiar with her. The first time I'd ever heard her name was with the Tyler, the Creator feature. Also, if you're familiar with Mahalia, who is a UK R&B artist, she kind of gives me Mahalia sound vibes at times. This album is, I feel like, very meditative. It definitely leads into the heavy neo soul sound. If you're not familiar with that at all, it's just a little bit more different. I don't know how to explain it. It's different than normal R&B, but it's a very unique sound that I feel like would definitely pull in normal R&B listeners. I was able to see her open at the Ryman in Nashville this year for an artist, and I actually didn't get into her until after I saw her, and had to go back and listen to her music, and very impressed with this album. And I would like to see her continue to grow in success for sure. The thing with this album is that it feels very outer world, very like, I don't want to say intergalactic, but like just kind of like out in space and astrological. But at the same time, it feels very down to earth. And I feel like she's able to just kind of take you on that journey of like out of this world with some songs. There's a song called Rental on this album, and it's just very out of body kind of sounding. But then by the end of the album, it sounds like we're in her neighborhood. And, there's a monologue where she's talking to some young people and some family members. And it's very interesting how she's able to take us from one high all the way back down to just very grounded sound, and just kind of like giving us an insight to her life. And it feels like we're listening to her walk through her neighborhood and talk to people that she knows personally. So I think that's a really cool experience. And I think the album as a whole definitely works as a whole project, right? I think there's great singles, but it definitely takes you on a journey. And I think that that's very special. So next we're going to talk about one of the other massive outbreaks of this year, and that is Brat by Charli XCX. Now this album is a phenomenon. It took over the whole summer. This year, 2024, had Brat summer. We saw Brat everywhere, and I can't help but be so happy and proud for Charli XCX. She's got so many albums under her belt, and she's come such a long way since we got her feature of on Iggy Azalea's track Fancy and Boom Clap from The Fault in Our Stars to now. She has continuously done her own thing. She does not care about trends. She does not care about following what everyone else is doing. She is doing her own thing, and she's gone so unnoticed for so long in the mainstream. I feel like she's a name that people know, but people don't know her music, and that has definitely changed now. Brat it's a never-before-heard album. There's nothing like it. I'm a big fan of electronic and dance music, and this is a straight electronic album. It's definitely still pop leaning, of course, but it's very true to electronic, and it's very much shows that electronic music is very important to Charli, and hyperpop music is definitely a trend that she has kind of been responsible for over the last couple of years. I think her last album, Crash, was a mainstream pop album. And, after so many releases that were not really paid attention to by the general public, I think she thought, I'm going to make a mainstream pop album and give them what they want. And it did all right. It was good. But I think that this is the album that she's always wanted to make. I think she thought, I've done the hyper pop, I've done the alternative pop, I've done indie, I've done mainstream pop. This is something that I really want to make, and she's making music for herself now. And of course, she's on a different label management than she was previously with Crash. But I think that, she was tired of making music for others and started making music for herself. And she made this album, I think, with the expectation that it was not going to do good. And it took a completely different direction. It became one of the most beloved albums of this year. And I just can't help but, like I said, be so proud and happy for her, because she's finally getting her credit with an album that's probably the most true to her and what she loves to make. After, like I said, so many failed attempts to make it in mainstream and getting commercial success, she finally made it with the album that's probably the most personal and most loved by her. She is such an interesting artist. This album is perfect for the club, for raves, but there's also some really open, honest, vulnerable songs on here. She's got her song Girl So Confusing, where she basically talks about the industry's comparison of her and Lorde, and she's basically telling it out, and Then we have I Might Say Something Stupid, which is very self-explanatory. She's got some songs that are just very, very honest about what she's thinking, and then she's also got some songs that are just straight club bangers, and I think that's a really cool experience and a very cool journey to go on with her. And of course, with this, the phenomenon just continued to grow, and it became a whole pop culture thing. We got deluxe versions. We got a whole remix album where she entirely redid the album and let people feature on every song and redo it and restructure it. And that's so cool, in my opinion. I think that letting other people put their spin on their music is so cool. And she just continued to basically run pop culture this year with, she had the Sweat Tour with Troye Sivan, which I was able to go to, and it was a phenomenal tour. And she had, she was able to pull literally almost every pop girl that was active this year onto this album. She saw a Dua Lipa monologue on Talk Talk. We had Guess with Billie Eilish. We had Sympathy is a Knife with Ariana Grande. She had Tinashe on a song. She was pulling in her normal features from like Caroline Polachek and Shy Girl. There was just so much going on this album, and it was great. And I'm so glad to see her get this credit, right? And she hit number 3 on the charts, which was a new high for her. And I think that's great. I'm just really excited to see what she does next. I hope she stays in this lane, but I also hope that Brat continues to get more acclaim. I think that she's also getting attention from the Grammys for one of the first years ever, and I think that she's definitely got a high chance at getting Album of the Year. Definitely one of the top 3 in my opinion, and I think this album is just so unique, so different, and like I said, I think it's just the most true to her, the kind of music that she wants to make. So I'm very proud for her. Definitely like this album. I'm glad because we didn't have many EDM albums that I feel like came out this year that were very solid, and so it's very cool to see this pop mainstream artist now basically control that genre and lead the direction of basically what trends are going to happen. I mean, she's definitely a trendsetter and is very much ahead of her time, so I think that a lot of people are going to move in this direction. All right, next we're going to get into a country release from someone that completely surprised me, and that is Carly Pearce's new album, Hummingbird. Now, I have never really gotten into Carly's albums or her work. She's got some good singles, but I just felt like she was kind of still finding her sound. I think that she's had a lot of her music focusing on her divorce and, finding herself in that, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but I think that with this album she has found this like newfound confidence in herself and in her work, and I feel like this album is definitely just very unique, and I feel like it pays tribute to a lot of the other women and trends in country music in the best way possible, right? She's got a song called Truck on Fire, which I feel like is just the perfect tribute to Carrie Underwood and her song Before He Cheats. That's just a classic. She's got some very tongue-in-cheek songs on here. In the song Head Over Heels, where she's talking about basically a girl that gets around town, and there's some lyrics in here that I was like, oh, because I didn't know what she was going to say, and it was just very comical the way that she pulled these things off. But I was just really excited to see originality from Carly, and I think that this album in the country sphere went a little bit unnoticed just because they were used to seeing the same thing from her. But I think that this album is a completely new direction for her, and it is great, and I'm glad to see new work from her that is just fresh and new, and I think that she has a very unique voice, very deep. The first single off this album was We Don't Fight Anymore with Chris Stapleton, and I feel like it takes a lot to get Chris Stapleton on a song. Like, he has to like really respect her work, and it was a really great record, and I think that people maybe thought that was just like a one-off hit for her, but I think that in reality it was just a look into how great this album is really going to be. There's just some really, really good songs on here, and I found myself humming and singing them. And like I've mentioned with a few of the other artists, I feel like there's some original concepts that are not touched on in country music a lot. So I was just really excited to see her take a new direction, and it definitely worked out for sure. Okay, next we got to talk about this album that I don't even know what happened with this album, Dopamine by Normani. So this album was something that was like 6 years in the making, right? This album was supposed to come out like every year for the past 6 years since her departure from Fifth Harmony. And Normani is a star. She is so amazingly talented in her vocals, but also being one of the only people that can like dance, but also hold her tune is insane. And I think that she's had some major hits. You know, she had Love Lies with Khalid. She had Dancing with a Stranger with Sam Smith. Motivation. She's got Wild Side with Cardi B. She's got a lot. I mean, she was also featured on the Birds of Prey soundtrack, Diamonds with Megan Thee Stallion, and she had a song with Ariana Grande. Very well respected, and I think that she has got the potential to be a mega star. I'm just not really sure where the disconnect is, other than the fact that her album was 6 years behind the crave for it, honestly. And I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with her releasing music in her own time. I definitely commend her for that. But I think this album just definitely underperformed only because it has been so long that people have been waiting for this album. They almost forgot that it came out. I would say that this is potentially the best R&B album of the year. And, you know, we didn't even get music videos. We didn't get any performances. We didn't get anything from her, no tour. And this music has just not gotten any promo, which is really a shame because it is such a phenomenal album. You know, she's been through a lot over the past couple of years, personally and professionally. And I hope that maybe she needed this debut album out to move into the next direction. But I also just don't want it to go unnoticed because it is such a phenomenal album. So well done. She's got James Blake, Stara, Cardi B, Gunna. She's got great collaborations on this album, and I just really did hate to see it go so criminally unnoticed. But it is a phenomenal album, and she is a star. She is, no matter if she is commercially successful or not, she is a star, and I hope to see her finally get more credit in the future. But if not, I know that she will continuously be insanely talented, and she will have a strong fan base still. All right, so we do have a couple more releases in June before we move into July, but I've given you guys enough new music to get into for now. So next week we will pick back up with part 3, get through the summer, and then we'll keep going into fall. There's still a lot of good albums to talk about, and I'm super excited to share those with you guys. I'm hoping maybe that we don't have any more surprise releases for the rest of the year, but if we do, we will include those. In the meantime, go listen to some music. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think I've left out, and we will get into some more on the next episode. Thanks for tuning in.